All right, well, hi everybody. My name's Clayton Hickey, and I am standing in today for Jackie Dell, who is unable to give this talk. I'm going to be speaking about the time course of incentive salience and naturalistic human vision. So in my lab, we've been looking a lot in recent years at this idea of incentive salience. And the basic premise of incentive salience is the idea that the experience of reward might do something to our representations of visual stimuli in the environment around us, changing the way that we intentionally select these objects when we encounter them in the future. And this is linked to the idea of triggers in addiction, of course. So the idea that drug use might activate the brain's reward system in a way that prioritizes visual stimuli that have been associated with that experience, so these become salient and difficult to ignore in the future. And these trigger episodes are thought to underlie relapse for a lot of addicts. So this is the general push that we're kind of moving at with this research venture. However, today I'm not going to talk about addiction and working with addicts per se. What we're doing in the lab is we're manipulating the financial reward associated with visual stimuli and looking at how that changes the representation of stimuli. And this has been done for a while. There's been, if you've been to VSS in recent years, there's been a lot of work done on this in the last 10 years or so. Primarily using visual search displays, synthetic visual search displays like the one on the left. So where participants have to search for stimuli identified by unique shape or color or this sort of thing, and reward gets associated to these features. However, in the lab, we've been working a lot more in recent years with naturalistic images like the one on the right that contain examples of people and cars and trees and all kinds of other categories. And then we look at the association of reward to a category of stimuli and how that changes selective processing of examples of that category. And that's what we're doing. So a few years back, Marius Palin and I did some work on this issue, looking at search through these sort of naturalistic visual scenes. And we did it with participants in the scanner. So we were trying to derive a measure of the amount of information that people were encoding about objects in these scenes using MVPA analysis of fMRI data. I won't go into the methodology there, but what we ended up finding was that reward-associated targets were boosted in their representation in visual cortex. So that is to say that when a category is present as a target in the scene, and the target is reward associated, we have more information in visual cortex emerging using this measure. However, when a category was present as a distractor in the scene, what we found kind of surprised us, and that was that we got a drop of information for that distractor stimulus. So it seemed like participants were suppressing information about the reward associated distractor in the scene. And at the time, we interpreted that as evidence of a short-lived salience boost from reward priming. So the idea here was that reward-associated stimuli in the environment become briefly very, very salient and hard to ignore, and that creates the need for long attentional suppression because participants have to get rid of this salient stimulus in order to continue search and find the target. Now, bold is slow, so in the MRI signal, we thought all we ended up seeing was this long attentional suppression because that overweighed this brief salience increase. But of course, this is conjecture, right? We're interpreting MRI data. We don't have any direct evidence using this methodology for this short-lived salience boost. And that's the purpose of the current experiment that I'm going to talk about today. So here we moved to using EEG as an index of processing of reward-associated categories in these visual scenes. In particular, where we use the N2PC and distractor positivity. Very briefly, the N2PC is an index of attentional selection. So if participants see a scene like this one and they're looking for cars, if they attend to that car, something happens contralaterally in the brain that does not happen ipsilaterally. In fact, that emerges at around 200 to 300 milliseconds. We get a contralateral negativity. And this contralateral negativity is a really nice index of the deployment of spatial attention, of the derivation of information about objects in the visual environment. If we take the difference between ipsilateral and contralateral waveforms, we get what's known as a difference wave. And this is a representation of the difference wave for the N2PC. So we see that the N2PC is more negative contralateral than ipsilateral. There is another very closely linked event-related potential component called the distractor positivity. And the distractor positivity is conceptually completely the reverse. It is now a contralateral positivity in the evoked potential that indexes suppression of a visual stimulus. When you ignore the car in this scene in order to derive information about, say, about this target in the middle, this person in the middle, then that ignoring process evokes a contralateral positivity in the evoked response. And so the N2PC and PD now define a continuum of selection At one extreme, you have full-on selection, strong selection represented in the N2PC. Then you have a whole bunch of intermediary points all the way to the other side where you have very, very strong suppression of a stimulus. And we can use this continuum as a measure of the selective processing of stimuli in visual scenes. All right, so to talk about the experimental paradigm for the experiments today, or for the single experiment I'll talk about today, we had participants search through scenes like the one on the top here that contained examples of cars and people. Their task was to search for an indicated a cued target category, for example, a car, and then report the orientation of the car that was present in the scene. So if they were searching for cars in this scene, here's the car over here. The car is facing left, so they would therefore press the left button, report that it was left. The response that was therefore a discrimination task. They had to first localize the stimulus and then report its facing orientation. One category, one of these two categories, was associated with reward for each subject. For that subject, whenever that was the cued target for a block, when they correctly completed the task, they received high magnitude reward for that trial. It'll become clear as I talk about it more in a second. So each block would start with a cue saying, hey, your reward category is cars, but currently you might be searching for people, say, as an example. And throughout the subsequent block of trials, participants just had to report the facing direction of people present in the scene. We ran 34 participants through this experiment, and we counterbalanced reward category across people. So half of the participants associated reward with the cars, half of them associated reward with the people, and importantly, all participants had to search for cars and people. So let's just kind of look at some scenes and think about this a bit, what this means. Imagine that the target in this particular block is people. The reward category for this person is cars. This scene pops up. The scenes were presented very briefly, so they didn't have the opportunity to move their eyes. They stayed fixated. But what they have to do now is then report the facing direction of the example of a person in this scene. If they correctly respond, yes, left, that person's facing left, they would receive 1 point for this trial because the target in this block is not the high reward category. Now imagine another trial in another block. The target in this block is cars. You've been cued to look for cars. The reward category for this person happens to be cars. There's a car in the scene and the car is facing right, so the participant correctly responds right. They therefore receive 100 points. Both of these two categories could be present in the scene at the same time. So here's an example where the target is cars, the reward category is cars. There is a car, the car is facing right. If you make the correct response, you get 100 points. That same scene could show up in another block where the participant was looking for people. So now the person in this scene is over on the left. He's facing the right. The correct response is therefore right, and you would only receive 1 point because this target category is not the reward associated category for this person. Similarly, the target in this block is cars. The reward category for this person is cars. There's a car on the left. The car is facing right. You make the correct response, you get 100 points. This same scene could show up in another block where the target is people. The person's in the middle. He's facing the left. You make the correct response, you only get 1 point because people is not your reward associated category. I'm going to add a little wrinkle to the design now. There was a third category of stimuli that participants were asked to search for, and that was trees or bushes. In this condition, they would be asked to report whether or not the scene contained a tree or a bush. They had to discriminate between those two options. So imagine they see this scene. This scene contains a tree. The reward associated category for this person is cars. The correct response is to say, yeah, scene contains a tree, but this scene now critically contains a reward associated distractor. There is this object over here that you've had to look for in the past, and when you've correctly selected that object, you've been rewarded for doing so. In contrast, this scene contains a neutral distractor, right? When you've looked for people in the past, you've had to look for them, but they haven't garnered reward. So now we have an example of a neutral distractor. And again, we can have neutral distractors that come alongside reward-associated distractors. And when this happened, critically, the reward-associated distractor was in the middle. And we can have reward-associated distractors that come alongside neutral distractors. So we can now look at the N2PC and PD to reward-associated distractors and the N2PC and PD to neutral distractors. And we can find out whether or not reward-associated distractors are preferentially selected. The event-related potential has these contralateral and ipsilateral waveforms, but what I'm actually going to talk about is the difference between them. So again, I'm just going to derive the difference waves for these conditions so we can compare the difference waves. When we look at scenes elicited when you had a lateral neutral distractor and the other distractor was absent from the scene, so you've only got one distractor category in the scene, you're looking for trees or bushes. That's the critical condition for this experiment. The lateral neutral distractor tends to elicit a more negative lateral response. So again, you're getting a bit of an N2PC riding on some sort of PD, but critically, the real thing that I want you to notice here is that the evoked lateral response for the lateral neutral distractor is consistently more negative than is the lateral response for the lateral reward associated distractor. And this is reflective of more selective processing. Across this continuum of selection all the way to suppression, we're seeing that the reward-associated distractor is more selected than is, the neutral distractor is more selected than is the reward-associated distractor. And we reproduce this finding in an independent data set from these subjects. So that is to say that there is a separate condition here where the other distractor is in the middle, a separate set of trials, and we find the same overall pattern. The lateral neutral distractor is selected more consistently throughout the whole duration of the ERP than is the lateral reward-associated distractor. So the reward-associated distractors consistently elicits less PD, less N2PC, or more PD. So this hypothesis of short-lived salience from reward priming that's followed by long attentional suppression doesn't seem to be the correct interpretation of what's going on in this type of situation. We see no evidence for this short-lived salience from reward priming. All we see in the event-related potential is suppression. So a reward-associated category that is consistently irrelevant is consistently ignored. Thanks very much for your time.